Hi everyone, thank you for coming today to join me for another great session of the Festive Tech Calendar. I hope you've enjoyed the previous sessions and maybe sessions that's coming up. It's that time of year again where we can create some great content for the community each day of December. Thank you to the team behind Festive Tech Calendar for making this happen. And yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to come and see me today. So just to introduce myself, as you saw from my slide just before, my name is Marcel Lupo and I am a Microsoft DevOps MVP. I do regular talks and blogs and contributions to the community in the DevOps space. Talk a lot about Azure DevOps. I have a big passion for GitHub and just DevOps in general, automation, infrastructure as code, things like that. So I wanted to talk to you today about something really cool in GitHub called GitHub Codespaces. Now, you might have not heard of GitHub Codespaces, but let me start off by asking a question. Have you ever had to build like hundreds of virtual machines or workstations for developers to work in? Maybe they're in your organization, there's lots of projects and you have to supply virtual machines or development workstations or development environments for developers to work in. Or maybe you're a developer yourself or an IT specialist and you need to start working on some code to be able to, do a project maybe, and you now need to go and configure your own development environment. Say you're just getting a VM and now you have to set up all your tools and all of these things. And if you are one of those people, you probably are aware or well aware of all the pain points that comes, with that. Some of those pain points are basically, just the time it takes to set up these machines, and then you have to configure them, and then you have to look after them, you have to patch them. Maybe there's security vulnerability, so you have to regularly upgrade them. Maybe the tooling is inconsistent. Maybe this virtual machine has got different tooling to that virtual machine, and the developer experience is kind of like all mixed because everyone's working in a little bit of it. You're all working in developer environments, but the tooling is maybe different, or the version of the tooling is maybe different, and the dependencies and the libraries and everything. Maybe the machine spec is too much, or maybe it's too little for whatever you need to do. So, all of these, the list can go on and on and on about maintaining these development environments. Now, this is where GitHub has brought something out called Codespaces. Now, a GitHub Codespace is basically, in a nutshell, it is a development environment that runs inside of a container that is remotely hosted on a cloud-based virtual machine linked to your code's repository. So you can almost classify a Codespace as a development environment as a service. You can customize the Codespace using a bespoke Docker image. And you can also, you can tailor the Codespace to meet your needs and of the project or the developers working on the project by using configuration files that you can then keep alongside your project's source code, which then basically creates repeatable and consistent versioned development environments or Codespaces. Codespaces also, they're also called dev containers, pretty much. And just to quickly show you, the Codespaces can run on, on a variety of VM-based compute options, and these are hosted by GitHub, and they can range anything from 2 core machines up to 32 core machines, and you can basically connect to a Codespace either from a web browser or a local running version of Visual Studio Code. Now, you might be wondering, who can use Codespaces? So if you've been following the GitHub universe, GitHub made a really big announcement recently that GitHub Codespaces is now available to anyone, and anyone who wants to use it. So what I mean by that is with a free account, you can have up to 60 hours of GitHub's Codespaces a month for free. GitHub Codespaces only used to be, in the past, only were only available to if you had a GitHub Enterprise account. And so this is a really, really great thing that is now available to everyone to be able to play with and explore. And yeah, just it's a great tool. And I'm going to show you a little demo on how you can actually get started with GitHub Codespaces, and we'll do a couple of things that you might find interesting. So on my screen here, you'll see that I've got a GitHub code repository. It doesn't have anything in it yet, but say I'm a developer now, or I need to start working on this code and I need to contribute to this code. You'll see here I've got a gitignore file, a license file, a readme file in this repository. But I don't want to, all I need to do now to get started with Codespaces is basically if you click on the code button, you've got the local tab here. So with the local tab, I can go and clone this repository to my machine that I'm currently working on. But I don't really want to do that. I don't want to work with this code locally on my machine. So on the next tab here, I've got Codespaces. So to get started with a Codespace, it's as simple as just clicking on Create a Codespace. And it tells you on which branch as well, which is my main branch is called the master branch. So if I click on that button, what it's going to do is it's going to set up a dev container or a Docker image, Codespace, a default image that is hosted by GitHub. And you'll see here that it actually opens an instance of Visual Studio Code in my web browser. Now you'll see here that I've got a URL and it ends with github.dev. And everything in this web browser is basically full functionality of Visual Studio Code. You can see here I've got my gitignore file, I've got my license file, I've got my readme file. You can see here at the bottom that I've got my master branch, and I can create new branches if I really want to. And you can see here on this on the left-hand side here, I've got all these extensions. I've got GitHub, GitLens, PowerShell, Docker. I've got all of these extensions on the left-hand side. Now, GitHub Codespaces is so, it's quite clever because I've got a local copy of Visual Studio Code installed on this machine, it can kind of pick up the extensions that I have and automatically add them for me into my GitHub Codespace. And this is all happening within the web browser. So you can see as well here, if I type ls, it'll actually tell me, the files that are in, dir, dir. You can see that the license file and the README file is here on my GitHub Codespace. Now, the next thing I want to show you is on the left-hand corner here, you'll see that there is a green button that says Codespaces. If I click on that, it gives me a few options that I can do. Like I can create, I can view the creation log, I can rebuild the container, I can stop the Codespace. But what I want to do is I want to open this on my VS Code desktop. So when I click on that, it's going to actually open up the Visual Studio Code that I have installed on the local machine. And it's going to then connect to the remote Codespace. So you'll see here that this is now running my full, I don't want to, installed client, Visual Studio Code client. And you can see here I've got my my gitignore file, my license file, and the README file. And you'll see all the extensions I have as well here on the left-hand side. But notice that this is still running on a Codespace. So say, for example, anything I'm doing here at the moment on this Codespace will be actually running inside of that container hosted by GitHub. So this is really, really cool. But what if I wanted to, let's say if I come out of this Visual Studio and I just come back here to my web browser. So say, for example, I add something here, like, I don't know, it's like this cool project. And then just going to commit this code. And I'm just going to call that initial commit and commit that. Remember, that's happening all on my master branch. But now if I go back, you'll see that if I refresh the page here, I have my file has been amended with this cool project. Now, say for example, I wanted to go back into my Codespace. I've exited my Codespace and I'm back in my repository and I want to go back. It's very simple. All you can do is just go back to code and you'll see your Codespace here. And you see that my Codespace is currently active. So it's still running. I just wanted to show, if you click on the settings here, you'll see I can now either manually stop the Codespace, or I can change the machine type, or I can rename the Codespace, or I can open it, reopen it in a web browser or my local copy of Visual Studio Code. Now remember, if I open it on my local installed copy of Visual Studio Code, say for example my local machine was just a 2-core laptop and it wasn't powerful enough for what I needed to do, but my Codespace was maybe a 32-core VM behind the scenes. All of that stuff that's happening in Visual Studio Code is still utilizing the compute of the container behind, that's hosted by GitHub. So I can do like some really powerful computational things on my Codespace utilizing that remote Codespace compute. Now, like I said, when you exit a Codespace, it will remain active for 30 minutes by default. And the reason that is to save on cost. So it will remain active for 30 minutes, but then it will just stop itself. Now I can manually stop that now, or if I needed this to stay active for longer, this is a configurable setting. So for example, what I could do is I could go to my org settings, and on the left-hand side under Codespaces, I just go down and I can then amend the default idle timeout. So I can make this anything from 30 minutes to 240 minutes, which is 4 hours. Like I said as well, when we created the Codespace, that uses a default image or a default container. And that container retention is, so say for example, I went into my Codespace and I installed loads of extensions to use in my Codespace. That, that container will be retained for about 30 days, but this is also like a configurable option that I can say. But just going back, just to quickly show you the Codespace here. So say for example, what if we wanted to customize our Codespace? Or maybe what if we wanted different Codespaces? Because maybe, with different VM sizes, potentially, because what if we have a database developer that's working on this code? Maybe we have a front-end developer, full stack developer. Maybe their compute requirements or their extensions are slightly different. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to reopen this Codespace. So once this Codespace is back open, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click on Codespaces on the bottom left-hand corner here, and then I'm going to pick the option that says Add Dev Container Configuration Files. And what this is going to do is it's going to ask me what image do I want to use, what Docker image do I want to use. So I'm just going to, there's a lot that you can pick from, but I'm going to pick Ubuntu. I'm just going to run a Ubuntu image, the default one. And then it's going to ask me what tools do I want. When this image starts up, what tools do I want to get installed of the image? So I'm going to say I want to use Terraform. I want to use maybe PowerShell. Maybe let's get Azure CLI as well. And maybe the GitHub CLI as well. And there's many tools that you can select from. There's like Argo CD, AWS, Docker. There's so many things that you can install tools into this image. So once I say OK to this, you'll see that it creates a special folder in my repo called .devcontainer. And in that .devcontainer folder is a devcontainer.json file. So if we look at this JSON file here real quick, you can see that it's got a name called Ubuntu, and it's referencing an image. And you'll see that the image is being referenced is from the Microsoft Container Registry, and it's an Ubuntu image. And the features that are being installed are going to be Azure CLI, GitHub, PowerShell, and Terraform. Now, this is obviously using an image from a Microsoft ACR. So there's no Docker file here in my repository. I'm going to delete this file and show you a little bit of a different way to do this. So I'm actually, using a custom Docker file. So I'm going to, in that directory, I'm just going to go and upload a different, two different files. One is a Docker file, and one is, again, a dev container JSON file. But let's have a quick look at this Docker file. And this is, say, for example, if you've got your own Docker files and your Docker images that you want to use as your dev containers. So this Docker file is actually referencing the same image, which is from the Microsoft Container Registry. But you can see here that I can pass in a variable called variant. And my variant, by default, is Jammy. But now what I can do with my dev container JSON file is I can say, instead of referencing an image, I want to reference that local Docker file. And the Docker file variant I want to use is going to be Ubuntu 22.04. So it's not going to be the default, which is Jammy. It's going to use this version of the image from the Microsoft Container Registry. But what I also want to do is these extensions that I have on the left-hand side here, I want different extensions. I want the PowerShell extension, maybe the C#.NET Tools extension, the Terraform, Prettier, and TFSec. So I can then customize my VS Code to have certain extensions. And I can also, again, add the features to say, I want, instead of having Terraform and PowerShell, I've added, in Azure CLI and GitHub CLI, I've added Git LFS and kubectl Helm Minikube. So I can add, and I can specify which versions, whether it's the latest or, PowerShell 7.1 or Terraform, the latest, whatever version I can now specify here. So now I've got my Docker file and I've got a dev container JSON file. So I'm just going to save this and say add custom Docker image for my Codespace. And I'm going to commit that code. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my repository and I'm just going to delete that default Codespace. I don't really want that anymore. Now, if I want to use my new Docker image, remember I've got my dev container .dev container folder here, and I've got a Docker file and a dev container JSON file. What I can do now is I can go to Code, to the Codespaces tab, and then I can select the option to say, I want a new Codespace, but give me some options that I can pick from. So here, now I can select a branch, and then you see now it picks up my dev container configuration. So say, for example, I've got my dev container configuration here. I want that specific configuration, but I want a 8-core VM. Now, if I create this Codespace, and this takes a little bit of time because what's happening now is it's actually going to go and build that Docker container rather than referencing it from an image from the, it's basically pulling and building this Docker container. So this takes a few minutes, but you can actually click on View Logs, and it will actually show you how, how it's building the Docker container, how it's pulling the image, how it's going to go and get the extensions, and it shows you everything on screen here. So it takes a little bit more time to build, to start up the Docker image. But just to quickly show you, if you don't want to wait each time for your Docker image to spin up, there is an option in Codespaces under Settings of the repository where you can actually create pre-built Docker images, which is basically, warm. So you don't have to kind of build that Docker image. It's already, you build it once and it's going to stay there. But let's just give this 1 minute here to finish. It's found the image and it's building the container for me. Like I said, you see now it's installing PowerShell and it's the version that I wanted. It's getting Terraform, the latest version, based on that configuration file. If you remember, if we have a quick look at it again, my dev container JSON file is saying to install this software into that container. And it's still going, and it looks like it's finished now. So now when this Codespace kind of spins up, you can see here that it's actually telling me, saying you're using a custom image. So I'm not using a default image anymore. I'm using my own custom-made Docker image. And you can actually use Docker Compose. You can use Docker files or Docker Compose to create Codespaces. I've just shown you here how to do the Docker version. And you'll also see that the extensions now is, it's installing that C# extension that I wanted, but I need to reload my Codespace for that extension to show. Now, say for example, you have different developers, like say you have, like I said, a backend developer, maybe a full stack developer, and you want different Codespaces for the different developers on this project. Remember I said here you can have your dev container folder. Now, what we can actually do is I can create a new folder underneath that, and I can call this backend underscore dev. Oops, we do backend underscore dev. And I'm just going to move my dev container and Docker file into backend dev. And then I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call this maybe DBA dev, a database developer. And I'm then going to copy those dev container and Docker files. So now you can see under dev container, I have backend dev and I've got DBA dev. Now, say for example, my backend dev needed a different variant of Ubuntu. Maybe they need Ubuntu 18 instead of 22. And maybe they need a little bit, maybe they won't need, they won't need Terraform installed. They might not need PowerShell installed, but they'll need Azure CLI, maybe GitHub CLI, maybe some different tooling. And my DBA, obviously, they would need 2204, and they would maybe need Terraform and PowerShell and all of these things. So now I've got two separate dev container configurations. So if I commit this and say added more Codespace configurations, I'm just going to save that and sync that. I'm going to go back to my repository here real quick. Oops, I'm going to go back here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just go and delete that Codespace because I don't really want it anymore. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and create a new Codespace with options. And this time you'll see now I can pick which container I want to create. Do I want to create the backend dev container? Maybe I can do that one on a 4-core. So I'm going to create that Codespace. And I'm just going to let that run for a minute because I want to create another one. Just going to refresh this. And then I'm going to rename this one, and I'm going to call this my backend dev Codespace. So go to that. And I know that that's a 4-core. So what I want to do as well is now add another one, but this one is going to be my DBA. And for my DBA, I want 16-core. I'm going to create that Codespace. And I'm just going to let that run for a minute. And I'm going to come back here and rename that Codespace to DBA. Dev Codespace. Okay, so now I have 2 containers building. It's going to take a minute or two, but once those are created, I can then now say that my development, my backend devs can use this Codespace or the image. They can maybe go and spin up their own Codespaces from that image, and it will have all of their tooling and all of their kind of the spec of their hardware that they need built into that Codespace. And the same for the DBAs. They'll have a 16-core VM. And what's really nice now about this is, like I said, because I've got my development environments, it's almost like a development environment as code. So instead of now having to go and build VMs and maintain VMs and the patching of those VMs and deal with the inconsistencies of the VMs between different environments, all I can do now is I have my Docker file for my devs, for my backend devs, and I have a Docker file for my DBAs. And I can now, I know that my if my backend devs need certain extensions, I can add those extensions. Or if they need certain tooling to be installed, I can install that on that image which they use. And the same goes for my DBAs. I can install their extensions and their tools, or I can configure it all as code. And all they need to do, all my developers need to do, is go to the Codespaces and spin up a Codespace that they would want to use. And that brings us to the end of the session. So I hope you really enjoyed Codespaces. There's like a wealth of documentation on Codespaces online, and like I said, it's an amazing feature, of GitHub. It just takes all that headache away of maintaining developer workstations, and it just keeps things consistent as well. So you can have, repeatable, reliable development environments that people can just kind of plug straight into and utilize that compute that is hosted by GitHub rather than hosting the compute yourself in VMs and things like that. So thank you very much for the time to come to see my session. I hope you really enjoyed it and that you learned something new. Again, if you've got any questions, send me a message on GitHub. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Just send me a message. We can talk a lot more about GitHub Codespaces. But that's pretty much a good introduction to really get you started in using Codespaces. So good luck and have a great festive season and enjoy the other sessions. Thank you very much.